of the slaveholding founding fathers 100 years earlier was that slavery was evil. Thomas Jefferson and other thinking leaders were conscious of their hypocrisy. They were conscious that they were establishing their own freedom while withholding it from those of African descent. But their economic self-interest won out over their consciences. They hoped that future generations would see the way clear to doing the right thing. So they passed the problem on to future generations. In the South, in the early 1800s, as time passed and the economy became more, not less, dependent on slave labor, a virulent racism arose to justify what the founders of the country knew was not justifiable. In order to continue to justify this continued use and even the expansion of slavery into new territories, Southerners had to develop a belief that slavery was not, in fact, evil. It's not something that they were tolerating within themselves as a kind of shameful thing, but rather, they had to start to believe, if they were to continue to be slaveholders, that it was in fact a positive good. And the only way that slavery could be a positive good was if there was something about being enslaved that made it a benefit to the enslaved person. So once the slaveholding South determined that slavery had to be good for the slaves, while avoiding the argument that they themselves, therefore, should be slaves if it's so good for you, they had to decide that the enslaved race was under the power of the slaveholder, much like a child is under the power of a parent, because that child is inherently unable to care for themselves. So while European Americans had always held racist assumptions that whites were superior to blacks, this assumption became exaggerated, hardened, and truly virulent in the 19th century, almost a fundamentalist kind of racism that insisted that blacks were not just less intelligent and less capable, but that they were really a subspecies, barely human, and ordained by God to be in need of mastery by whites. This racism in our country was the ugliest of what human beings are capable of, equal to the loathsome anti-Semitism of the Nazi regime. It was the barest sort of ideology developed to serve a community's desperate desire for wealth. A community deluded itself into hatred of one class of humanity in order to pillage that class of its economic power. In Nazi Germany, the Holocaust allowed Germans to seize the property of Jews, to take their businesses, to take their positions in universities, insisting that it was a positive evil to have this inferior race in possession of so many goods. In the American South, the people of Africa had been stripped of their possessions when they were kidnapped and brought here to work. So while here it was their labor that was stolen from them, in a system which was upheld by violence, that was inherently violent because it was upheld by the constant threat of violence. Now, the consciences of the Northerners did not suffer quite the same constraints as those in the South did, because those who did not possess slaves, those who lived in communities where no one they loved or lived closely with owned slaves, were freer from the need to justify slaveholding, and so were freer to see the fallacy of the virulence of that strain of racist thinking. Yet almost all Northerners continued to hold the view that blacks were inferior to whites in their intellectual capacities and their ambition, and almost no one really wanted to have them integrated into white society. They believed that blacks were inferior, presumably because it was just what was assumed. It was in the air around them, this assumption that whites were superior. And perhaps many contacts with African Americans reinforced the stereotypes. They would miss the circularity of the logic. If we have a society which treats a class of citizens as inferior, we don't educate them, and we keep them in perpetual servitude. And even when they are free, then they will, because of that very fact, be less educated, because we have decided they're not educable. So when we meet them, they are in fact less educated, which we mistakenly associate with being less intelligent, and may act as a self-defense mechanism in a way that does not challenge the assumption that they are inferior. Because of their servility, because of their lesser education, we therefore conclude that they must be less intelligent and inherently inferior. There's a neat circle of logic that takes place. But one of the few white men we know of who, even in the 19th century, had the capacity to see through this circular logic was the infamous John Brown. Even among the liberal abolitionists, Brown stands out as having been truly non-racist to his core. In his biography of Brown, historian David Reynolds describes the man as being one of the very, very few who truly understood blacks to be the absolute equals of whites socially, intellectually, and morally. And he tells the story of Brown at around age 12 being friends with a slave boy who was his own age, and they both traveled with a family across several states. And when Brown witnessed the difference between how he, as a white person, was being treated versus how his dear friend, as a slave, was being treated, it so deeply morally offended him that it stayed with him for the rest of his life. Unlike even the most forward-thinking people of his time, Brown stood alone in this way. He not only spoke of the need for abolition, but he was, in fact, a man of action. He was an active member of the Underground Railroad and even set up a station for the Underground Railroad on his own property. But even more than this, he stood alone as having socialized with African Americans, hosting them at his dinner table and being a guest at theirs, seeking their counsel and having full faith in their capacity, their power, and their will to effect their own freedom. And it was this faith in the capacity of enslaved Africans to free themselves that led him to plot one of the most infamous of slave revolts, and the one which probably did the most to spark the Civil War, which would come a year later. John Brown's scheme came along at this increasingly desperate time, when tensions in the country were very, very high, and violence in the country was very, very high. As a white man, he was able to persuade many in the abolitionist movement to give him financial support. In particular, Brown had a cadre of financial backers called the Secret Six, half of whom were Unitarian. Theodore Parker, the great Unitarian minister of the 19th century, was one of his backers. Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe, Julia Ward Howe's husband. Julia Ward Howe, of course, is the one who took John Brown's body, lies a mouldering in the grave, and gave it more respectable words. And Thomas Wentworth Higginson, another Unitarian. These were three of the Secret Six who financed the raid on Harper's Ferry. Unitarian Bronson Alcott, the father of Louisa May Alcott, who was also Unitarian, thought so highly of Brown that he wrote, "I am curious considering his matured opinions on the great questions of personal independence, the citizen's relationship to the state, The right